Hey guys, in today's video we are installing the cheapest air fuel ratio gauge I could find on the internet. So I already installed the sensor, so I had to have them weld on this bung for me. Did not come with a bung, so you have to buy that separately. But the whole thing was like $22 including shipping, so you know, what can you expect? This is a 4-wire one, so it is a narrowband. A wideband sensor is way more expensive than $22, and this was $22 for the whole kit. Good news is the car's been running just fine, been driving it to work, done about 500 or 600 kilometers in it now, and no problems to report. But yeah, we're installing this gauge today just to basically see what you get for $20. Now I know it's a narrowband, so you can't really use it for tuning or anything like that, but it would be good to know if the car is constantly running rich or perhaps constantly running lean.
Perfect.
Already opened it because I had to let them install this for me on the car. I bought these plugs really cheap. You know, these aren't expensive. I bought like packs of them just to clean up the install a bit. So there's another gauge coming soon. Okay, so here's the gauge, air fuel ratio gauge. They obviously include the sensor, Rambo, but look at the website. Interesting. Anyway, so this is a sensor for another time. But yeah, like I said, all this stuff, I think this sensor and that and shipping was around $22, so you know, really cheap. You're not really going to buy much for that. Now I am aware that it is a narrowband, and I will explain later exactly what a narrowband is. But you know, let's see if it actually works or what it does. Because some of the videos I watched actually means that this thing won't work. It should give you only one value on the screen of the display. But according to the seller, it won't. It'll actually work like a wideband sensor. It does look nice, have a little plastic on it, black outer edge. Packaging is the basic packaging everything comes in. I think every gauge I've ever seen comes in this box. Doesn't matter what brand it is, apart from the real stuff. So included you get a small wiring harness, you get the gauge, so I'm just going to pull out of here. You get the gauge. Now, you know, this doesn't feel like a high quality thing, but I think it does look nice. You know, they did make it look nice. So I think once installed, you will basically only see this. Looks good enough. Has this, you know, you tighten it around the edge to make it sit in your gauge pod. So that's good. That's good, I guess. You get this worth already installed. Oh, and of course you get some instructions. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so in terms of instructions, it looks like they just give one instruction for all the gauges they sell. And then you just have literally everything: exhaust temp, voltmeter, pressure gauge, water. It's okay, I guess. So we are looking at this one here, the air fuel ratio gauge. And at the back of the gauge, you can see it says red wire, 12 volt, yellow wire, also switched 12 volt. So these two both go to ignition. Not sure why it needs two wires. And then you have the black one, which is obviously the negative. And then they say green to ECU, which is definitely wrong because there is no ECU wire on this car that has anything to do with the O2 sensor. So I think what we will do is we'll connect the O2 sensor output wire to the gauge green. So we'll basically connect these two to a switch 12 volt, basically ignition. This is a ground. This one will go to the signal from the sensor that we installed. Now the sensor, of course, didn't come with any instructions, but I did look up on the internet, and this one basically has 4 wires. Let's just pull this thing off. So you have these 4 wires. You have a black one, a gray one, and 2 white ones. Now the 2 white ones is for the heater, so the sensor itself has a built-in heating element because it needs to be at a certain temperature to operate. So these two, you put one to the battery or one to a relay, basically a battery source, so 12 volt and ground. So it doesn't matter which one. So this is a ground and a 12 volt. Then the gray one, apparently that's a ground wire for the sensor. And then this is the signal output. So the black one is the signal output. I'm not exactly sure why they would make the black a signal output. Doesn't make sense. But that's what the internet's saying. So how we're going to wire this is these two will go to a switch 12 volt. One goes to a switch 12 volt. The other one goes to just a ground. Probably just like a chassis ground. The black one will go to the green one on the gauge. And the gray one will just go to a ground as well. So, easy enough. Now the problem is obviously they don't give you a loom. This is not a, an Innovate or AEM gauge where they actually give you looms and stuff. So you have to make your own looms. So we have to make a loom for the sensor. So I'll use just these wires, just normal automotive wire. I have a thin one for like signal wires, a bit thicker one for, let's say, the heater element wires. So I'll just make a small loom for the gauge, and then I'll make a small loom for the sensor as well, using these plugs, because luckily they all use four wires, and these are 4-wire plugs. So I'll put a plug on the sensor end, and I'll put another plug on the end of this little loom they gave us, and then just use these wires to actually make up the rest of the wires we need. Okay, so these basically work. You get a male and a female plug, and then you get a male and a female little pin. And then obviously you get the 2 plugs. They also just plug in to each other. But now the problem is you need this crimping tool. And this thing is actually, it's quite expensive. I had to pay like, I think around $30. $30 for this thing. So it has these little edges, all these little crimping, basically to crimp these ends. You see the ends are open. So yeah, the tools I'm going to use is just this wire stripper. It's just a basic wire stripper. Like I said, you have to invest in this one if you want to use these little, if you actually want to just put plugs on the end of wires, because the only way for you to actually connect this is you can basically twist and tape, or you can use lugs and just crimp lugs onto it. That's also not bad. That's how I was doing it before. And if you really have a lot of time, you can actually just solder the ends together. Problem with that is later on, if you want to take the stuff out, you have one piece of wire that's, you have to cut it to take it out. You can't just unplug it. Where yeah, if I want to unplug this, I can just unplug this, and then the loom and the gauge can come out. Same with the sensor. If I just solder wires on there, you won't be able to remove the wiring loom from the sensor. So later on, you might want to use the wiring loom for a different sensor, but then you'll have to cut it and redo it again. Where if you just put these plugs on it, makes it easy it basically future-proofs your build. And I know we are definitely not going to keep on running this. We are installing something proper. But just for now, I actually just want to see if this actually works, because technically this shouldn't work. See how this gauge actually does say rich, optimal, and lean. Now, from what I've heard on some of the other YouTube channels, this sensor, which is a narrowband, shouldn't actually work. This sensor should give you a 0 volt output or 1 volt output. The seller actually said it doesn't. It gives you a range of outputs from 0 volts to 1 volts. So it will actually give you just a narrow range, but the sensor is probably calibrated for the narrow range, so it will actually give you all of this kind of stuff. So we're going to install it and see. Maybe this is just a cool gauge people can put in their cars to just look cool. There's lots of stuff we do just to look cool. And maybe you have an NA car and you just want to put a few gauges in there. It's no use in you putting a boost gauge in there. And this gauge actually looks cool because it has all the lights around the edges and stuff like that.
Perfect.
Okay, so I think they came out fine. The black one, we did crimp the non-crimpable part of the plug a little bit, but I think we can salvage that. But I mean, the rest of them came out pretty nice. You just have to make sure that you actually get the wire in the first crimp, and then the casing of the wire, and then the open part in the second crimp. So I folded it double just so the wire doesn't stick into the, probably doesn't matter if it does, because this is the part that will go in the plug. But I just folded it double so there's a bit more wire, because these are really skinny wires. Now we have to get these into this. See, there's 4 little holes in there, the same as this. So we now have to push these in there somehow to get them to lock. I'm not sure if you have to pull out the red retaining clip first that's in there, but I'm just going to try and push them in, see if they will actually lock without me doing that. Of course, before we do that, we have to put these little grommets on. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that, considering this stuff was all really cheap. These plugs, these connectors, you know, quite cheap stuff. You can get this off Amazon, AliExpress, whatever works out best for you. Okay, now the next thing we have to do is actually get pins on these wires. So these are a bit thicker, so I think it'll actually be a bit easier. Also, the mount stripped off is ideal for the pins we want to crimp on here. So yeah, let's do this. The working area is a bit more uncomfortable because I don't really want to take that sensor out of there. Okay, so some of you may have noticed we actually moved location. I decided to just take the sensor out because these wires were just short, just too short that we can't actually get the crimping tool into that space. So I decided it's going to be better just to take the sensor out. I thought it would be a bit easier. I was expecting the wires to just stand out a bit more. And of course I smashed my, oh, actually bleeding. I smashed my finger trying to get the sensor off because I didn't want to break loose, and then it decided to break loose all of a sudden, unexpectedly, even though I was expecting it. So I'm sure you guys saw this, but I do put the pin in the correct position, and then I put the wire in from the back side, check it, and then crimp it, just because holding the pin and the wire steady is actually quite difficult. So I find that doing it this way is a bit more controllable. Okay, and there you have it. Pin this plug. The bigger wires definitely make it much easier. It's easier to crimp. You can actually just push the wire, take the wire and push the pin into position using just the wire itself. You don't need to use the little tool I was using. But I mean, that was the easy part because these two was the only 2 looms they gave us, and now from here we have to do it all ourselves. So let's put the sensor back, and then we can probably go and wire this up. Okay, so we have the sensor back in with the plug at the end, all pinned up, nice and neat. It's out of the way, won't really get near the exhaust. So now let's quickly go inside the car and then have a look at where we're going to install this. Now, I don't know if any of you guys know, but down here is a fuse box under this plastic cover. So if you take if you open that fuse box, you're able to see there's little pins that's unused, and you can actually just tap into those. Okay, so I pulled off this panel at the bottom here just to get access to all the wiring down here. So as you can see, there's all these little pins here. You have a whole bunch of them that takes plugs. Now, I mean, your car might actually use some of these plugs. This car's a base model, so a lot of this stuff is not used. Now, how these work is some of them give constant power, some give power at, let's say, the first key. So if you key on to the first ignition position, they will start giving power, and the other ones are accessories. So you can see the gauges and everything comes on here. So as soon as you turn then everything basically comes on. Now what we want, because it's gauges, you do want them to only come on at the second key. So what I have here is just a test light. So I grounded the test light on this piece of metal here, and I'm now just going to look at these pins to see if we can actually find one. Okay, so one thing that is important to remember here is that the air fuel ratio sensor is a voltage based sensor. So the sensor itself works on a 0 to 1 volt range. So it's actually very important for the voltage to not have any interference or any shared wires with other sources of power or sources of ground. So even though I used a fuse box to get a power and a ground, that actually affected the output on the gauge itself. When I turned on the park lights or when I turned on the indicators, the air fuel ratio output would actually change on the gauge just because I was using a shared ground with something else, and that was affecting the voltage being seen by the gauge itself. So you can use the fuse box as a power source. You can use it for something like a radio remote wire or amp remote wire, stuff like that. Comes in very handy. You can use it for other gauges, but specifically because the air fuel ratio gauge is voltage based, it is very important to not share any wires with anything else. So what I actually did was I ran the wires directly to the battery's terminals, because this was a very temporary install and I didn't need to do it properly. I just ran all the wires straight to the battery, connected them, hardwired them, and then there was absolutely no interference with the gauge output when I used any of the other electronics on the car. Okay, so here we go. Negative, just a little lug, both positives, little lug. Here's the loom they gave me. So this should technically now work. I'm just going to put this locking thing on the top there, and then I'm going to go plug it into the gauge and connect it up to the little pins we identified, and then this thing should work. Let's quickly see if it does. Okay, so here's the wires, here's the plug, and it's hooked up to those. This is the earth we identified, that's the ignition 12 volts we identified. So it's just pushed on there. I put the gauge up here. Basically now if I turn on the car, the gauge should come on. So let's see. And it does. It actually looks really nice. The camera doesn't pick up, but it's actually very blue. Oh yes, this also doubles as a voltage meter. So as you can see, currently it's saying 12.5, and then it has a little red light there that says voltage. Okay, now the voltage light went off, and you can see the thing is just flashing 10, because obviously we don't have a signal wire yet. So there's no signal wire wired in yet from the sensor. So that's basically what it will do if you do not have any sensor connected, or let's say if there's a fault or anything like that. So let's quickly do the sensor wiring. Okay, so we have it installed temporarily, of course. This is all coming out again. So here's the heater wires now. I just ran them over the engine. One goes to the negative and the other one to the positive. And it's been on here for a while, and initially if you touch the little lug on the battery you can see it spark. So if I do it now, it's not sparking anymore, so it's almost like it stopped drawing current by itself, which is strange. Sensor itself is warm. If you touch it, doesn't burn you, but I can feel the sensor is warm. So yeah, the heater definitely works in it. Now an interesting thing is if you come in here now, you can see now it says 20. So I'm going to start it now. Drive the car around for a bit, let it heat up and see if it does anything else, because it does look like it's back to 11 where it was, but let's see if that actually makes any difference to the reading while I'm driving. Okay guys, so I did film a bit too much content for this video. If I had to edit everything, it'll probably be a 30 to 40 minute video, so I'm just going to do a quick voiceover to sum everything up for you guys. we do have a side-by-side now of the narrowband and the AEM wideband. So let's start with the narrowband. Basically, is it worth it? Would I buy it again? Does it work? And yes, I would say yes to all those. It does work, it is worth it, and would I buy it again? I would definitely buy it again if I needed to fill a hole in a gauge pod, because it does actually look good and it functions as well. Now, the differences between the wideband and the narrowband that I noticed is the narrowband one responds a bit slower. It does respond fast enough to pick up on a quick gear shift, but the AEM one is much quicker and it is much more sensitive. You can see the air fuel ratios moving up and down slightly, and then if you compare that to the narrowband, they will actually stay very still, very stagnant. They won't really move up and down all that much, where the AEM one is very sensitive. Now when it comes to the readouts were very similar. Cruising, we were doing about 11.9 to 11.4, and it was exactly the same on the wideband. So is it accurate? I would say it is accurate. It is definitely not as fast, it is not as sensitive, but it is accurate. I would not recommend using it as a reference for tuning, but I will say that if you just want to see what your cruising air fuel ratios are, or if you want to make sure that your car does not go lean for long periods of time, this is definitely a gauge that will be able to tell you that. And I mean, considering it's only $20 including the sensor, that is a very good price. I mean, you can't really go wrong with that. There's not much you can do with $20 anyway. Secondly, it does look quite good, the gauge itself. The camera does make it look a bit worse than what it actually looks in real life. It's actually very blue. But yes, it doesn't really compare to the AEM one. The AEM one is far superior and far nicer. You can also just by feeling it, feel that it's a much nicer gauge actually. But in short, yes, I'm very happy with the gauge. It exceeded my expectations for what I expected from a $20 gauge. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.